2020 was surely a year that was the strangest in memory for many people. There was nowhere you could hide from corona mania as it became the most dominant topic on the news, social media, and everyday discussions. It would be unusual to hear someone say they were not affected by the mass phenomenon in a fairly significant way. For me, the corona crisis brought about an awakening, and I know many of you have reported a similar experience. Personally, it led me to dive much deeper into my own profession and to think much more critically about what doctors actually do. I think that medicine as a whole suffered incredible damage to its reputation in 2020, with more people expressing distrust and confusion than ever before. How did the medical system get this way, and what have we got to show for something that continues to consume resources with an insatiable appetite?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
Firstly, I don't think it was just the year 2020 that medicine lost its way. This has been going on at many different times in different ways. In Virus Mania, we point out that hyped up germ theory sent medical practice in some wrong directions in the late 1800s. Famous scientists such as Louis Pasteur were highly influential, and it wasn't until 1995 that much of his research was exposed as fraudulent. We quote medical historian Gerald Geeson as saying, "The conclusion is unavoidable. Pasteur deliberately deceived the public, including especially those scientists most familiar with his published work." Unfortunately, the damage was done, and generations of medical professionals have been trained with a skewed understanding of the role of microbes. Rather than understanding the balance, many seem to think we are at war with them. A broader perspective of this theme is outlined over several chapters in Virus Mania. With regards to viruses specifically, Dr. Stefan Lanka has pointed out that virologists hit a crisis in the 1950s when their attempts to directly extract presumed viruses from diseased individuals failed. Additionally, control experiments of that era revealed that cells decomposed and released the same proteins, regardless of whether they were infected by viruses or not. All attempts to obtain incriminating electron micrograph images from naturally obtained virus-damaged tissue similarly failed. Unfortunately, the world was misled once again when Nobel laureate John Enders published his 1954 paper purporting to show cytopathic effects from so-called measles viruses. To be fair, he actually issued some warnings in this paper, including, "It must be borne in mind that cytopathic effects which superficially resemble those resulting from infection by the measles agents may possibly be induced by other viral agents present in the monkey kidney tissue or by unknown factors, and additional observations, however, will be required before it can be confidently asserted that dermal epithelial cells are specifically attacked by these viruses." However, many virologists were not interested in these warnings and felt there was no need to trouble themselves with adequate control experiments. Virology was resurrected, and enough hot air was in their sails to get through to the late 20th century, when virology morphed into biochemistry with techniques such as PCR. However, what has not been well publicised was a German court case in 2016 following Dr. Lanka's offer of €100,000 to produce a study proving the existence of the measles virus. Dr. Lanka faced a challenge but kept the money safely in his pocket, and in his words, it is now part of the German jurisdiction that the publication of the Central Method of Virology from June 1st, 1954, in which the unintentional and unnoticed killing of cells in the laboratory was published as proof of the existence of disease-causing viruses, no longer constitutes proof of the existence of a virus from the year 2016. For those of you that are interested, check out Dr. Lanka's video below with regards to his recent work with Project Emmanuel. This project involves a series of experiments to investigate the validity of the techniques being used by most virologists in the present era. This includes the cytopathic effects being portrayed in electron micrograph images, as well as the way in which viral genomes are generated. As I've pointed out in several of my previous videos, there has been a suspicious ongoing lack of valid controls with many of the studies, and this seems to be another case of virologists not following the scientific method. Due to YouTube policies, I'm not sure I can explicitly state the potential implications of Dr. Lanka's experiments, but I can say the virology establishment won't like it.
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
But it is not just in the field of infectious diseases and virology where things seem to have drifted off course. The pharmaceutical industry's influence on medical practice is now so huge that a significant proportion of the scientific literature is simply promotional material written by drug company ghostwriters, as is exposed in Peter Gotche's Deadly Medicines and Organised Crime. This is literally a deadly problem, as Gotche points out, that in the United States and Europe, drugs are the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer, and the actual numbers may be well higher. It was estimated that the number of deaths directly attributed to pharmaceuticals reaches as high as half the deaths attributed to tobacco smoking. Gotche puts this down to ineffective drug regulations, over-medicalization, polypharmacy, and most doctors having too little knowledge about the interactions and harms of drugs. One quote in his book that struck a chord with me was, "We really need drugs. We are really in situations where a drug may save our life, or where a drug could make a major difference to our lives." A systematic review showed that stopping antihypertensives and psychotropic drugs in the elderly generally went very well, and for the latter group of drugs it resulted in fewer falls and improved cognition.
I honestly think you ought to sit down calmly, take a stress pill, and think things over.
However, in the year 2019, global pharmaceutical sales topped $1 trillion for the first time, with the United States incredibly accounting for almost half of this. The trend indicates that the great spend up on drugs is set to continue. To put this in perspective, the entire GDP of New Zealand is around US $150 billion. It boggles the mind to think that New Zealand's entire economic output for 3 years would not even cover the pharmaceutical bill for the US for 12 months. But what have we got to show for all of this? Peter Gotche has dedicated decades to collating and analysing the actual evidence for the effectiveness of all these medications, and his conclusion is sobering. In his book, he makes the case for around 95% of the spending on drugs being unnecessary. The numbers are absolutely staggering. Think about the resources that would be freed up to actually make our planet a healthier place. Gotche was forced out of the Cochrane collaboration in 2018, and much of this has been attributed to the spectre of the pharmaceutical companies that influence almost every aspect of the medical industry. I'll put the link below that documents the crisis of the Cochrane collaboration and why the group is now likely to be far less reliable than they used to be with regards to the evidence behind vaccines and other pharmaceuticals. One of the parts that stood out to me was Cochrane has become too sensitive to criticism of the pharmaceutical industry, says one board member. They don't believe in democratic plural science, said one outgoing board member. Good governance of science always requires open debates. The prestige of a scientific institution has to do with its ability to manage critical debates, not censor them. I believe the third area that has derailed medical practice is government regulations. One of the pivotal events last century was the publication of the Carnegie Foundation's Flexner Report in 1910. As Murray Rothbard stated in his book Making Economic Sense, Flexner's only qualification for this job was to be the brother of the powerful Dr. Simon Flexner, indeed a physician and head of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. Flexner's report was virtually written in advance by high officials of the American Medical Association, and its advice was quickly taken by every state in the Union. Following this, medical schools and hospitals in the United States were subject to strict licensing. Most countries around the world similarly followed suit. Allopathic medicine, i.e. practice based around pharmaceuticals and surgery, became the state-sanctioned definition of healthcare, and popular alternatives were forced out of business. As Rothbard goes on to say, the AMA was able to use government to catalyse the medical profession, to push the supply curve drastically to the left. Literally half of the medical schools in the country were put out of business by post-Flexner state governments, and thereby to raise medical and hospital prices and doctors' incomes. I can tell you firsthand that the degree of control that the regulators try to exert over medical practitioners went to level 10 in the year 2020. Doctors and nurses were censored and in many cases fired for giving opinions different to the official government narrative. And no, we're not talking about North Korea. We're talking about countries like the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Recently, the New Zealand Medical and Dental Councils released the following statement. As a health practitioner, you have a role in providing evidence-based advice and information about the vaccination to others. Evidence-based. For the first time I can recall in my practicing career, they go on to suggest what we should do with our own bodies. The dental and medical councils have an expectation that all dental and medical practitioners will take up the opportunity to be vaccinated, unless medically contraindicated.
Have you any idea how much longer this cover story will have to be maintained?
I don't know, Bill. I suppose it'll be maintained as long as deemed necessary by the council.
After a lifetime of medical practice, Irish professor Seamus O'Mahony warned in 2019 that, despite its global dominance, this medical industrial complex has given us meagre, feeble comforts at vast expense. Its chief concern is its own survival and continued dominance, and its ethos is a betrayal of the scientific ideals of the Golden Age. Similar to my own feelings, he believes that this has led to a state where medicine no longer knows what it is for. Unfortunately, politicians seem to think they know what medicine is for, and as they become increasingly unconscious, seem to believe they are bringing you health through even more regulations. Recently in New Zealand, we saw the introduction of some new legislation, and let's take a look at some of the terminology. Yes, you saw that correctly. Administration of a commercial product to humans has made it into our legislation. What could possibly go wrong? So there you have my thoughts on why 2020 was the year in which medical practice lost contact with the very essence of what it is supposed to be. The combination of misplaced microbe theories, the unhealthy influence of Big Pharma, and the monopolised regulation of medical practice all coming together to bring most of us a total disaster.
I know I've made some very poor decisions recently, but I can give you my complete assurance that my work will be back to normal.
Now, obviously, there have been other corrupting influences, so keep the conversation going in the comments with your thoughts as to why medicine is in the state it's in, and more importantly, what can be done to rescue it. Don't get me wrong, there are still lots of great aspects of medicine and people who genuinely want to improve it. Personally, I think there is reason for optimism as 2020 saw the political medical industrial complex cause a crisis which woke up more of the world to the nature of the beast. There was someone else who felt that there was reason for some optimism too.
And eventually, it may even reach politicians and media people. Eventually, even they may be destined to become conscious.
To help sustain my channel in this time of censorship, please support my work on Subscribestar. Link is in the description.